Good afternoon. My name is Linda Dixon, and I'm the Health Law Director at the Mississippi Center for Justice. Welcome. Today is the first National HIV Criminalization Awareness Day, an opportunity to shine a spotlight on HIV criminalization as a part of a broader pattern of criminalizing people based on disfavored identities, health status, and disabilities. This two-part event and panel discussions will draw connections between HIV criminalization and other forms of criminalization and over-policing, and point to coalitions and partnerships that offer new pathways for broader criminal justice reform. The Mississippi Center for Justice, along with the Center for HIV Law and Policy, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, the Williams Institute at UCLA Law, Prevention Access Campaign, SUNY Downstate Heat Program, and Fair Trials bring to you this webinar on confronting HIV criminalization, promoting criminal justice reform to protect marginalized communities and end mass incarceration. Now I turn it over to Amir with the Center for HIV Law and Policy.
Thank you so much, Linda. I'd like to really thank you all for joining us today on this, inaugural commemoration of National HIV Criminalization Awareness Day. On a date that was not chosen randomly, we are here, at the end of Black History Month, and truly a racial justice lens is critical to understand the role of how the United States criminal legal system has weaponized identity and disability and disease against our most marginalized communities. My name is Amir, as Linda said. I'm the National Policy and Partner Strategist with the Center for HIV Law and Policy. And from here, I'd like to just invite our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves and maybe explain a little bit about how their work connects to the HIV anti-criminalization movement. So to begin, I'd like to invite Mandisa.
Thank you, Amir. Somehow I didn't know that I would be first. Hey everybody, I'm Mandisa Moore-O'Neill, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm based in the Deep South in New Orleans, to be exact. I'm a very proud Black feminist attorney who is really excited to use a Black feminist lens as both an organizing and a legal strategy, and an abolitionist that is invested in dismantling all the things that harm our people.
Thank you so much, Mandisa. Eric, would you like to introduce yourself?
Like Mandisa, I didn't know I was going to be called on so early as well. So hello, everyone. My name is Eric Reese. My pronouns are he, him, they. I guess one of my big hats that I wear is I'm the state director of the Human Rights Campaign here in Arkansas. And as you know, the Human Rights Campaign is the largest LGBTQ plus civil rights organization in the country. But the hat that I'm also wearing today, which intersects in the work that I do, is I get to serve as the co-chair of the Arkansas HIV Reform Initiative, which debuted today with National HIV Awareness Day, Criminalization Awareness Day. One thing we've got to work on is our long titles, just so I know. But I am glad to be here just to share what's going on in Arkansas and being a part of this conversation. Y'all know it's needed. This is that next wave in this pandemic we've been dealing with for the last 30, 40 years. So I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'd like to invite my colleague, Norma, to introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Norma Escavel. I'm a staff attorney with CHLP, which is an organization that's committed to fighting against the stigma and discrimination at the intersection of race, health status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. I'm also the proud daughter of 2 Guatemalan immigrants, and I always like to bring my personal perspective to this type of work, especially, as Mandisa said, when it comes to abolition and dismantling the systems that harm our communities. And I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, thank you, Norma. We're really excited to have you too. Alicia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon. I am Alicia Reid Owens. I'm a staff attorney with Mississippi Center for Justice. I have the pleasure of managing our medical legal partnership where we provide direct services to individuals living with HIV. And in that medical legal partnership, we have an advocacy component where we advocate for issues affecting individuals with HIV. And amongst those issues are HIV criminalization issues. I'm glad to be here as well.
Thank you, Alicia. And last but not least, Nathan, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Nathan Cisneros. I'm the HIV Criminalization Analyst at the Williams Institute at UCLA's School of Law. Williams Institute is dedicated to rigorous, high quality, independent, policy relevant research, especially research that affects LGBTQ+ communities. I should say as well, I'm here representing Williams Institute today, but none of our work at Williams Institute wouldn't be possible without our founding director, Brad Sears, who's also been engaged in this issue specifically for decades now. And we are happy to share some of our findings today.
Thank you, Nathan. I actually wanted to, you to be last to introduce yourself because I'd like you to share a little bit about that high impact research that the Williams Institute has been doing for years. The Williams Institute, for folks who may not know listening in, has been tracking and analyzing and reporting on data relating to HIV criminal laws across the country. So Nathan, if you could paint us a big picture of patterns in this enforcement data of how health status has been weaponized against people living with HIV across the country, what are some of the patterns that you might be noticing at the Williams Institute?
I'll share 3 takeaways from the enforcement data that we've been able to analyze in a number of states. By enforcement, I mean arrests, prosecutions, and convictions for these HIV-specific criminal offenses. And I have some data. I wonder if we could put that on the screen. I'll start with takeaway number 1. You can see a little bit of it here, and that is that Black Americans and women are disproportionately affected by HIV criminalization. So what you see on the screen here is we have a number of states arrayed across the screen. That blue bar on the left is that state's population in 2019 who identified as Black or African American. The middle bar is the percent of the state's population living with HIV, again in 2019, who identified as Black or African American. And then that orange bar, here we're looking at convictions. That orange bar shows what percent of that state's HIV-specific, HIV-related criminal convictions are accounted for by Black people in the state. And what you can see is that orange bar is bigger than the blue bar or the yellow bar. So whether you're comparing to the state's population or the state's population of people living with HIV, Black Americans are overrepresented essentially everywhere that we look. And I have another piece of data, and I want to focus on the intersection of race and sex or gender as well. We can look at Black women and the policing of sex work and sex workers. And maybe we have that as well. If not, then I can walk, there we go. So now we're looking specifically at Black women. Again, that blue bar is the percent of the state's population who are identified as Black and female in 2019. The middle one is the percent of the state's population of people living with HIV. And then this time we're looking at arrests because we don't have convictions for all of these states. Again, what we see is, in this case, Black women are really substantially overrepresented in those states that criminalize sex workers who happen to be living with HIV. And it's not regionally or geographically concentrated. It's not a red or blue state thing. You can see California all the way over on the left, Georgia all the way over on the right, and that orange bar really towers over either of the yellow or the blue bar. So that's takeaway number one, that Black people, Black Americans and women are disproportionately affected. And in states that criminalize, that have HIV-specific sex worker penalties, we see really substantial overrepresentation, especially of Black women. I'll give you a second takeaway, and that is that some people come into contact with the criminal legal system solely through these HIV-specific criminal allegations, and people are arrested, prosecuted, convicted for alleged conduct that could never result in transmission. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Virginia, we saw that 18% of people arrested for HIV-related, alleged HIV-related crimes had no other criminal history. That is, their only contact with the criminal legal system was through these allegations. We see in Ohio, for example, 1/3 of all arrests were for behavior that could never result in transmission. So these are things like solicitation, loitering to engage in solicitation, harassment by an inmate, attempted prostitution, etc. In ongoing research that we hope to release later this year in Tennessee, we observed in at least 52 of 55 sex work-related arrests that resulted in conviction, incarceration, and then sex offender registration, which if you're a sex worker and living with HIV and you know your status, a conviction results in mandatory sex offender registration. That registration is for life now, as of 2010, because you're considered a violent sexual offender. In at least 52 of those 55 arrests, the sex worker was engaging with an undercover police officer. So this was a sting operation. And often the service negotiated was oral sex. Again, this is in the real world, not a transmission route at all. So people are being arrested, convicted, and put on the sex offender registration, registry for behaviors that I think, even in a worst case scenario, would never be a transmission route. Often, and I'll say as a side note as well, we think these are actually poverty crimes, essentially. The amount of money when we have that information available from the police affidavit is really quite small, right? These are, we think, people who are trying to survive and instead are being entrapped, arrested, and convicted. A final big takeaway. We tried to put a dollar cost to just the incarceration in jails and prisons for people convicted of HIV-related offenses. And the amounts are in the millions. So in Missouri, over 17 million just to house people incarcerated. Georgia, over 8 million. Florida, over 12 million. And of course, that doesn't take into consideration all of the costs to the state before that conviction, and of course, all the real human, emotional, social costs that individuals, their families, and their communities experience through HIV criminalization. So I'll stop there.
I really appreciate you adding that final point, Nathan, because we are talking about this incredible irrational burden on constituencies and taxpayers. But we're also talking about really tremendous social costs to American mass incarceration, to viewing HIV criminalization as a gateway where marginalized communities make contact with the criminal legal system that is maybe a person's first contact with the criminal legal system, targeted because of their health status, perhaps targeted because they're a sex worker fighting for survival. And now the state has unleashed, countless trauma and harm on that person because of their health status or their identity. There was one question in the chat that I thought makes more sense to just ask you briefly and quickly now, Nathan, about whether and how the Williams Institute has been able to understand or analyze data relating to Black trans women in the enforcement data.
I wish I could give you some concrete numbers there. Unfortunately, people who might identify as trans essentially disappear in the data that we're able to analyze. That's data that are produced by law enforcement officials, the court system, and departments of corrections. We know that people who might identify as trans, if given the opportunity, are over-policed, over-criminalized. We know that at the Williams Institute from other research as well. And this is also a plea for other scholars and researchers in this domain to collaborate on new ways to surface these voices and people whose identities tend to disappear in the official figures.
Thank you, Nathan. You know, I'm reminded by some of the themes that you're raising with what Alicia had raised a moment ago about medical legal partnerships in Mississippi and how they've been able to advocate for clients there. Since we're talking about, you know, people living with stigmatized diseases targeted by the criminal legal system, you know, Alicia, could you share with us a little bit about some of the, you know, maybe the biggest challenges, but also the you know, the most rewarding aspects of medical legal partnerships in Mississippi advocating for people living with HIV?
Of course, Amir. So the Mississippi Center for Justice, we're grateful to have a medical legal partnership with the Mississippi State Department of Health Round White Part B program. As many of you know, our listening audience may know, a medical legal partnership is a healthcare delivery model aimed at treating the whole person, focusing on income support, housing, education and employment, legal status, and personal stability. The most rewarding aspect of medical legal partnerships serving people with HIV are the three core activities that's kind of structured into the medical legal partnership that allows us to be proactive in our approach to providing the holistic care. For example, with our medical legal partnership, individuals with HIV benefit from our frequent training of clinicians and staff on stigmatizing behaviors and language, as well as legal rights in an effort to combat instances of discrimination. They also benefit from our direct legal services in the areas of employment discrimination, housing discrimination, and privacy rights violations. This is rewarding because we get to focus on the whole person and not just HIV. But the most beautiful aspect of the medical legal partnership, in my opinion, is our ability to work closely with the medical providers to jointly advocate on issues impacting our clients, such as we're doing today, HIV criminalization. Now, medical legal partnerships across the country have the ability to change the trajectory of health outcomes for people with HIV. I would say perhaps the greatest challenge for the medical legal partnership continue to be funding sources, but specifically relating to Mississippi, the Mississippi Center for Justice Medical Legal Partnership with the Mississippi State Department of Health Round White Part B, we're currently the only medical legal partnership in the state of Mississippi. And although we're proud of that, we believe that this is a challenge because we believe the presence of more medical legal partnerships throughout the state will be beneficial to individuals with HIV we may not be able to capture.
Yeah, you know, thank you for sharing that, Alicia. And I wonder, it's pretty striking to learn that there is only one medical legal partnership in the state. And I wonder if you think that's a reflection of HIV stigma in the Deep South, in states like Mississippi. You know, how has stigma affected work, not just relating to medical legal partnerships, but also the hard work that folks are doing on the ground to change the law in Mississippi?
Ooh, now that's a good question, Amir. So stigma has really proven to be stifling and toxic to HIV criminal legal reform in Mississippi. When we say stigma, we're talking about the negative attitudes and beliefs an individual have regarding specific characteristics. So essentially, we're fighting mindsets, and that's not easy. So put another way, we're fighting an individual's moms or daddies and grandmamas and granddaddies and big mamas and teachers and preachers and media outlets from the 80s and the 90s that have told them or shown them to be true about HIV. Have you ever tried convincing someone that what their mama told them was wrong? That's not easy. And so the toxins of stigma has prevented some individuals with HIV from advocating from themselves and being able to share experience to initiate reform. It's prevented lawmakers from having a listening ear to be educated on the science of HIV. And this toxin is basically what fuels discriminatory behavior. And when I think about HIV stigma in Mississippi, I'm often reminded of this poem, and it's called The Cold Within by James Patrick Kenny. And I really encourage you all to go out and read this poem. But the poem tells a story of 6 people who were trapped in the cold and dark around a dying fire. Now, each one of them had a stick that could keep the fire alive where they all could be warm, but because of the negative attitudes towards each other, they all died holding their sticks. And although it seems like they died from the cold temperatures, it was the coldness inside their minds and hearts that ultimately led to their demise. Now, the center had a project where we did surveys and asked individuals with HIV to give us one word that described HIV stigma. And those words were lonely, abandoned, worthless, and trash. Now, these words demonstrate the coldness that stigma evokes. In Mississippi, we are continuing to educate on the dire consequences of HIV stigma. We don't want the cold within preventing us from realizing true HIV criminal reform.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm really taken aback by your remarks, and I'm glad that you raised how difficult it is to change hearts and minds in this work, because I think there are tracks here, and a lot of folks listening in are familiar with some of these tracks. We have a lot of attorneys listening in who are familiar that this is a legislatable process. We need legislative advocacy, but there's also the hard work of changing the narrative around people living with HIV and really taking control of that narrative against that toxic mindset. And I'm also I think we would be remiss if we didn't connect this with legacies of anti-Blackness in this country. We heard from Nathan that there are racist biases in enforcement of these laws, weaponized disproportionately against Black women, for example. So, I was wondering, Mandisa, if you could share a little bit about your experience in criminal defense and what has it revealed to you about the relationship between anti-Black legacies in this country and the criminal legal system and HIV criminalization?
Well, first of all, I'm so grateful to be speaking after you, Alicia, just because of how you grounded it. And as a Black woman, also from the Deep South, I just have a lot of respect for all the ways that we are often left out of most conversations and then make our own spaces, and because we've had to. But anytime that we are having a conversation on criminalization and we're not explicitly saying the word Black, that's like a huge red flag. Like, to have a conversation on any type of criminalization and not talk about historic and current white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism, which are siblings, which are not these either or categories, they literally all work together. That is the basis for why criminal laws exist. It was to catch enslaved people as folks ran to their freedom and fled. And that is the basis for criminal laws that exist to this day. And just thinking of the fact that what's really at the core problematic about criminalization is the way it sets up these dichotomies, right? That, you're either good in this absolute way or you're bad in this absolute way. You are deserving, or you are undeserving, right? You're the victim, however that's defined in often white, feminine terms, or the perpetrator, which is often defined in Black, masculine terms. And as much as you try to fall in that favorable category, the lens will always move to ensure there is always a class of people who tend to be darker, who tend to be undocumented, who tend to be poor, that will never be able to meet those categories of good and deserving, and people who are worthy of our attention and our time and our love and our humanity ultimately. And that's the conversation about HIV criminalization. There's never been a criminalization, whether it's of people who are pregnant, of people who terminate pregnancies, of drug use and drug access. It will always be on race, gender, and class lines. And that is ultimately true of HIV. So as you can see in my background, I'm a proud and founding member of Louisiana Coalition on Criminalization and Health, which is a statewide coalition started in 2016, trying to address these laws in Louisiana, which our state, based on its legacy of chattel enslavement for almost 100 years, the Port of New Orleans was the largest domestic slave trade in the country. So to me, it's no surprise that 100 years later, we incarcerate more people than anywhere else in the country, because that legacy literally is still in the Port of New Orleans and all of what people love about New Orleans and all of those things. And it's no surprise that if you spend half an hour at criminal court on Tulane and Broad, and if you know what that means, almost everyone is Black. And the people who are not Black are working class. White people of means are not criminalized. That then, it grows the idea that, oh, those people don't do quote unquote crimes. These people do crimes because that's who you see. That's who's being locked up. That's who's pleading. That's who's trying to pay for an attorney, all of those things. So how does that then play into who are the people that we see in these sensationalized articles about HIV exposure? Who are the people who we see? Who are the people who are having to navigate the criminal legal system, which isn't working for anybody, let's be very clear. So then folks see that, like, and as you said, our people see it, our families, our lovers, our children, the people who we have happy hour with, and the people who we work with see it, and that then influences who we see as criminal. But the part that's also challenging is the ways that we in the HIV world also internalize messages of who's criminal. And yes, I'm talking about social workers who love calling their cops on clients. That's a part of this mindset, and lawyers, who call the cops on their clients. That's a part of this mindset of criminality that is inherently rooted in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so until that is addressed, and as was mentioned, it's not a matter of a diversity training, because guess what? If it was, it'd be over, because everyone's been to a diversity training, a DEI training. No, it's actually harder work, and it actually requires us to have to face our own internalized transphobia, internalized anti-Blackness, internalized classism, internalized ableism in the ways that we, good intent or not, are a part of perpetuating something that ultimately is harming all of us. Because if this pandemic didn't make it clear, when they come for you at 5 p.m., they're coming for me at 6 p.m. So let me organize to make sure no one gets come for at 4 p.m.
I think that's an important frame here, right? Organizing, cross-movement organizing, building bridges and alliances with these intersectional movements, the war on drugs, just white supremacy in our criminal legal system, criminalizing and weaponizing disease and disability against the marginalized folks that we're talking about. So I think that's a really great framing, Mandisa. And I wonder if you could, do you know why? Why do you think folks in the HIV anti-criminalization movement have sometimes not done that great of a job connecting this work with the broader legacies of anti-Black racism? And how can we do a better job, bridging that gap?
So I think it's a few reasons. One of the reasons is it doesn't pay to do so. you know, and I think I'm speaking with a lot of people in this room who interact with funders in different ways. And something that is often challenging is the work that's fundable historically and also currently is actually not work that's actually changing systems. But what I think we're all trying to navigate is it's often work that is perpetuating, because actually we know the things that are needed in order like to get the world that we want to live in. And it's something that it's actually not profitable to critique the person who's paying you. And if we know that profit is built on anti-Blackness, then it's kind of hard to then be like, okay, well, you know, like I'm going to engage in this work that is critiquing a system that someone is benefiting from. I feel like that's a cynical but also true framework. I also think that, again, because there's this idea that racism, sexism, transphobia is about an individual, how you feel about somebody and not something that's systemic. So because I'm told, well, I like XYZ marginalized population, therefore I can't possibly participate in a system that is harming them, because that's the dominant framework. It's really hard to have inroads and be like, actually, it's actually not how you feel about somebody. It's actually you are participating in a system, and you can actually choose to not participate and to dismantle it in these concrete ways. So my hope, and I'm saying this as somebody who's in the HIV world, who has been a funder, has been, you know, employed by nonprofits, I want to see us take a uncomfortable and serious look at the ways that we are a part of perpetuating these systems. No, the blame isn't always on the outside. You know, I'm thinking of, and I know I say this all the time, but like thinking of all the times I've had to talk a case manager down from calling the cops on their client because of their interpretation of imminent danger. And so that's something like, and like so many of us are unwilling to honestly engage. Another thing is, and I see this a lot, it's often on the people who are experiencing the harm to have to fix it in a way that is fundamentally unfair. So I'm not somebody who's living with HIV, so I'm always conscious of how am I not putting the burden solely on my siblings who are to have to deal with, you know, stigma and oppression, call it out all the dang time, and then also, you know, have all the solutions and then say in a nice way, because if you don't, then someone gets offended that you were mean when you called them racist. That's just like so much. So, you know, how do we make sure that it's not all on whoever it is, trans folks, you know, queer folks, Black people, undocumented folks, or all the ways that we show up in all of those. So I'll stop, but I'm curious as what others think too.
Yeah, you know, I'm curious too, and I promise we're getting close to Q&A. But you know, before we get there, I wanted to, you know, speak to our last two panelists. You know, Norma, could you tell us a little bit about your experience representing non-citizens in criminal and immigration proceedings? Because I think that a lot of people listening in today are probably curious about the relationship between HIV criminalization and how this country confronts and weaponizes disease and identity against non-citizens too.
Certainly. So before working with CHLP, I was a public defender representing individuals in both the criminal legal system and in immigration proceedings. And what that experience really underscored for me is everything that Mandisa said. So all of the tenets that you have in the criminal legal system, anti-Blackness, xenophobia, racism, that all reverberates strongly in the immigration system as well. And that's because the criminal legal system is inextricably linked and in fact intertwined with the immigration system. So individuals who are non-citizens, most of whom are going to be Black or brown in the criminal context, are then directly ensnared into removal proceedings. And this is particularly concerning when non-citizens living with HIV are prosecuted or even just arrested under an HIV-specific criminal law. And then they're likely going to be placed in removal proceedings afterwards. And their HIV status will most likely be weaponized against them in the immigrant legal system. So what I mean by that is that when someone is placed in removal proceedings, what will likely happen is two things. So first, they're going to be in bond proceedings, which determines whether or not they can be out on bond during the duration of their immigration case. During that context, I can imagine that DHS and prosecutors, DHS is the prosecuting arm in these cases, is going to use their conviction or even just an arrest under the HIV specific criminal law to say that they are a danger to the community and therefore should not be out during their immigration case. And that will then deprive the non-citizen of having a meaningful opportunity to engage in their defense and removal proceeding. And then afterwards, also, I can imagine that it's going to be used against them in the trial as well. You know, and the other concern, obviously, beyond just the context of the actual legal proceeding is what exactly is happening to non-citizens who are living with HIV in ICE custody. What are the conditions of confinement that they're faced to endure? And I'm reminded specifically of two trans women who were in immigration detention. So I'm speaking specifically of Roxana Hernandez and Johanna Medina Leon, both of whom were extremely fierce self-advocates and knew exactly what they needed during the course of their ICE detention to live, to survive. And all of their pleas for help just fell on deaf ears. And both unfortunately died either while in ICE custody or shortly after being released from ICE custody. And so while society would like to probably think that these are just aberrations, you know, we don't know. We don't know if these are aberrations or if this is something that's actually a pervasive pattern of ridicule, of denying trans women and LGBTQ people and non-citizens living with HIV in ICE detention of the dignity, integrity that they deserve and the protection that they deserve. So I think what society needs to reckon with when it comes to ICE detention, especially with non-citizens living with HIV, is that the immigration system is a carceral landscape that needs to be disrupted because detention is not safe or humane for anyone, but it is especially violent for people who are living with HIV and who are LGBTQ, or even living with conditions that are manageable outside of custody.
Thank you so much, Norma. You know, I'm glad that we left it there because, you know, there is a clear and demonstrable public health crisis with the American criminal legal system. It increases negative health outcomes just from mere contact with it, which is what's so horrific, about the data and information that Nathan shared at the beginning of this panel discussion, where health and identity is weaponized against deeply marginalized people, and it's actually their first contact with these harmful systems. So I think from that framing of a public health crisis, Eric, how do you think we can even really effectively end the HIV epidemic in the context of the war on drugs and mass incarceration and wielding the criminal legal tools against public health issues in a public health problem?
Ooh, that is a deep one there, right? Well, I think first thing off the top of my head, we can't. We just cannot. We must really and truly rethink, I think, this whole, how we've been dealing with this pandemic for the last 30, 40 years, right? It's time, particularly around criminalization. And, all the speakers before me, if y'all could see, I've just been scribbling and writing and thinking, and thank each of you, oh my goodness, for creative thoughts in the directions that we can go here in Arkansas. And just this kind of change, as I think you had alluded to, Amir, this is around changing hearts, right? And that is the difficult work. This is also around changing systems that have been in place for, 30, 40, 50 years even. So, here in Arkansas, even today, we debuted our HIV decriminalization work here under the HIV Reform Initiative, right? And, I'm thinking about our coalition here, and, I have the benefit, I get to serve as co-chair, but like all the folks that are on this webinar, Amir, I am working with folks who have been doing and working in HIV in Arkansas for, hey, 20, 30 years even. We got people that are living with HIV that are sitting in this initiative and on this coalition. And that is something that's vital right there, right? The data that Nathan had brought up, and even as we've added to it, this is also around curing this and dealing with this loneliness, right? This is around, as Medisa said, defining deserving and who is not deserving, right? This is also around how we're going to reshape and come back into community now, right? Because I think of this as kind of another wave of this pandemic that has hit my community as, same gender loving, queer, Black, in the South, raised in a community that has loved and take care of me. And this is why I do this work, because once again, my community is being, pretty much attacked around this with this law, right? My community that I know who are sex workers, right? My community that are Black and trans here in Arkansas, right? And also my community that, who are undocumented here, right? I mean, and once again, we're talking about the South, right? We're talking about rural South. And, one of the things I always say is, as the South goes, so does the rest of the nation. Well, as we begin changing these systems here in the South, so the rest of the nation, right? And it has to be done. Now, with our coalition, something that is vital for us we grounded ourselves in just really talking about values, right? How we're going to do this work. And we're still in that, if anything, that infancy that's going on, coming together, really talking through these issues, pulling all our tools and resources together to really deal with this stigma and lack of education around this issue. I mean, here in the South, we know stigma is hard. Stigma is hard as that red clay in Arkansas, right? And we have to begin having the hard conversation, the courageous conversations in our faith spaces, right? In our institutional spaces as well. Our different departments, our different state departments, those different policymakers, we have to have those hard conversations. And for me, what's most important, we have to have my family and many others who are living with HIV to be the leadership in this, right? To make sure that they are leading and we are truly supporting the changes that are going to be transformative, right? We don't just want to, we can just kind of draw up a bill or anything like that, but we can also be mistaken of criminalizing others. Like we've had, conversations around, we don't want to add to the prison industrial complex. We don't need to add to that. So we really have to think through, what does it mean for HIV criminalization here in Arkansas, that we're not going to criminalize others, that we're not going to criminalize our Black sisters, our Black mothers that are here, our Latinx brothers and sisters, and also our trans community, right? So we really have to be clear about that. So I'm going to end, but I'm going to end on saying, look, Arkansas is right there around here in the South. We must begin dealing with the issue of, I like to call it Puritan politics, that very conservative wave that is coming back into the South in a way that is real. Part of the work that I get to do, is deal with policies that affect my LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters, right? And right now here in Arkansas, across this country, and particularly in the South, transgender communities are under systemic attack, right? You had Texas that, the Texas governor has written this crazy policy that, we're actually harming our trans youth who are seeking and are a part of medically affirming care, right? So these type of crazy asinine policies are coming out. and to the South, and we have to begin recognizing those as well. So we're not going to end the epidemic with those type of policies that are coming into place. There's just no way. It ain't gonna happen. So we've got to raise our voice. We got to, yes, dare I say, get a little bit more creatively disruptive around this issue in a way that is going to really build coalitions and change policies. So I'm gonna be quiet at this point, but thank you.
No, I really appreciate everything you said, Eric. And I think, you know, by making those efforts broad and diverse, those coalitions intersectional, we stand a better chance, right, to combat a harmful and stigmatizing and reactionary wave of policies that hurt our communities. And I'm so glad that you raised the importance of values in this work, because, you know, one of my favorite prison abolitionists, Mariam Kaba, has always said that the work that we do has to be principled and it has to be consistent. So principles are important to us at the Center for HIV Law and Policy and all of our partners here today. I'd like to share our Positive Justice Project guiding principles in the chat. So I'm going to make sure to drop a link for folks listening in. They might be really useful to you in your own state level organizing. I know they've been very helpful and useful to folks across the country, especially in Arkansas, who have created their own principles based on the Positive Justice Projects. So with that, I'd like to actually open it up to Q&A, and I would like to start with you, Eric, because I did see a question in the chat about supportive health departments. How supportive have health departments been in efforts to change and reform HIV criminal laws? And I know that in Arkansas there is a partnership and a relationship between advocates working to change these stigmatizing, horrible laws that actually in Arkansas define people living with HIV as a danger to the public or as a threat to the public. So obviously, health departments, these stakeholders are implicated in this fight. We can't do this without them. How has the relationship in Arkansas with the health department affected reform efforts?
Oh, well, thank you for that question, Amir. So like you pointed out, here in Arkansas, among the initiative that we started, there is representation from the Arkansas Department of Health, and the Arkansas Department of Health has been, at least to me, clear that part of the work around HIV prevention has to be decriminalization, right? They've said it and stated it in our strategic plan here in the state. And like I said, there are members of the Arkansas Department of Health that sit with the initiative. But I want to be clear, and this goes not just for the Arkansas Department of Health or my organization, Human Rights Campaign, but anyone that's serving in a coalition, that we still must examine ourselves. I think Mandisa said, why are we at this table and what we're trying to do in a real way, right? What is the actions that we as a coalition or an individual State Department or individual a service organization or just in the individual advocate, what are we willing to do? What is the actions that are needed to really change this law here in Arkansas, right? We've got to deal with and work with a legislature that, I've had conversations with legislators that said, oh, we still dealing with this, right? This was back, I thought we dealt with this back in the late 80s, early 90s. And so we needed the Department of Health there to help us with educating those policymakers in a way that, as a community of folks, we maybe can't do, but they have access to do, right? But they also need us, right, to make sure that we're all in alignment and that it's grounded in with people living with HIV in Arkansas. Because anything else is just going to be, I think I saw somewhere in the chat, a Band-Aid. And we're not just talking about making Band-Aid moves, right? We're talking about healing the wound, right? That's what we're talking about. So hopefully that answered your question there, Amir.
Thank you. Yes, and I do hope actually for the person who asked it in the chat, that was a helpful response. I think this issue of like a Band-Aid is actually a good segue to another question I saw in the chat. because, actually, if we could get the timeline up on the screen for folks, that would be really helpful. Since 1994, states have been working to either repeal or reform these laws that criminalize people living with HIV. In 1994, Texas repealed its statute, but sadly, people are still criminalized in Texas under the general criminal code, general crimes like reckless endangerment, aggravated assault, all the way up to attempted murder, right? And just like what we heard from all of our speakers, we're talking about situations that oftentimes could not even theoretically or scientifically result in an HIV transmission. And people might be charged with these really serious, harsh felonies regardless. So, but ever since then, states have been working to reform these laws, and we've seen a lot of amazing victories, and you can see that summarized on this timeline. It's also on the Center for HIV Law and Policy website, hivlawandpolicy.org. It's been updated to reflect even the most current changes to the law, including New Jersey, which just repealed reference to HIV and STIs in the code there. So I did see a question in the chat about let's see. In instances where, and this question is from Christian, who actually is a part of the Arkansas effort. So folks from Arkansas might be familiar with Christian. In instances where there has been a successful reform or repeal of an HIV criminalization law, could panelists speak more about the parts of that reform that worked well and made that a successful change to the law? And maybe just to broaden Christian's question for our panelists, because I know a lot of them are members of coalitions in states where maybe they haven't really gotten to the finish line yet. Maybe you could also just share about how state laws change in your state that hasn't really helped. Maybe actually, could we start with Mandisa? Because I know in 2018, Louisiana did attempt to modernize its HIV criminal law. So Mandisa, could you share, with us a little bit about 2018 in Louisiana?
I'm laughing because once you made that modification, I was like, well, Louisiana has a great example of a quote unquote modernization that has continued to criminalize people in the exact same way it did before. But our law is one of those that focuses on intent to expose, which is super broad, super problematic for all the reasons. Exposure is wild to me as a basis, as opposed to intent to transmit. And our modernization in 2018 did not change that. It is still intent to expose, which is the reason why the numbers actually have not changed, but are consistent. But it did add this entire new category called affirmative defenses, not to get all geeky and criminal law up in here, but an affirmative defense essentially moves the burden of trying to prove the case, which every prosecutor must do. But an affirmative defense then moves that burden onto the defense, which is, again, our people. So people who are often accessing public defense via public defenders who are overworked and don't have the resources to actually mount a defense. This then puts the burden on that person to say, well, I actually did the thing that is illegal, but I had a good reason. So imagine what happens if that defense isn't viable. You can't then say, oh, actually, I didn't do the thing, because literally you just mounted this entire case on an affirmative defense. So it puts too much of the burden. And I'm a believer, you can say what you want to say about it. It is the burden of the prosecutor to prove every part of it. At no point to me is it just to make the defense have to do their job. We pay taxes for you to prove that every person you incarcerate did what you said they did beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'm not going to pay twice to have you not do your job. That's just how I see it. So it just really but it makes it harder on our coalition in the sense that having these conversations, folks are like, wait, didn't we just deal with this 4 years ago? And we're like, it didn't actually, so it makes it harder to have, because folks like, it was done with already. But yeah, it added a whole new category that, again, is just, to me, it has actually made it worse for our people.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Mandisa. I know that advocates across the country have seen the effects of reform, and some have really meaningfully felt those changes, and some haven't. Some have shared with me that they don't really feel that way. And Christian, it's a great question. I don't know if we have that much time to dig too much into that topic, but we do have a timeline on our website of all the states that have changed their law with the big takeaways of what changed. I also see so many great questions. We're approaching the end of the hour. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I'm going to put my information in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me, and I can answer your questions offline. But before we leave, I see one great question that I think is a great ending question to this discussion, because it was mentioned that we need to have uncomfortable conversations to kind of, disrupt complacency. Right. This is a criminal legal reform issue. And I think having those uncomfortable conversations is a big part of that. Because we're having uncomfortable conversations about stigma and disease in the midst of a global public health crisis right now too, where you have different political forces pushing one way or another on, the transmission of a communicable or infectious disease. But we're also talking about really potent anti-Black racism and stigma. So the individual Kelvin asked, what would that look like? What would it look like to have those uncomfortable conversations on the national level? Nathan, could I turn to you for a quick response to that question? What do those uncomfortable conversations look like?
I think my fellow panelists might have a better answer, but I think one way of starting that conversation is to point out to everyone that we all have an HIV status. That status might be positive or negative. We might know that status or not know that status. And then to reflect on laws that criminalize behavior simply based on that status. So if I don't disclose my status to my intimate partner, that might be legal or illegal, simply because of my status, and all the other facts can remain exactly the same. And to try to imagine what that would look like, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that like status neutral approach is one mirrored by, some folks at CDC right now, which I think it's a helpful way to frame the discussion. But we're at the hour, so I'm going to pass it off to our host, Linda Dixon at the Mississippi Center for Justice. But before I do, I just want to thank our really incredible panel. I want to thank you all for your leadership. It's been a pleasure to work with you all and see these efforts change over the years. And it's been great to share the stage with you all. And with that, I'd also like to thank everyone for joining in the discussion, and I'm going to pass it off to Linda.
Thank you, Amir. Yes, this was an absolutely wonderful discussion. So we are going to reconvene and have our second panel at 3:05 p.m. 3:05 p.m. So we'll convene that panel just a few moments. So thank you so much for being here and for sticking with us. You don't have to log off. You can just mute yourselves, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. For those who have joined us for the second panel, we'll be getting started momentarily. Okay, I think we're ready to go. I'm Catherine Hansons. I'm the founding executive director of CHLP. I wanted to really thank all of the people that presented on the first panel. Just amazing discussion, amazing work. And with warriors like you on the planet, I think it's enough to give all of us some hope and hopefully some motivation to act. CHLP is co-founder and home of the Positive Justice Project, which was launched in 2010 and is the first and largest national network focused on HIV decriminalization. There has been great progress, including growth of a movement that includes dozens of state coalitions and significant legislative victories in a number of the 14 states that made big changes to their laws in the last 5 or 6 years. However, there still is much to do, even in a number of the 14 states that have done some reforms. CHLP's map provides a snapshot, and I'm not sure if it's coming up or not. There it is, a snapshot of the state of US laws that single out people living with HIV, people living with hepatitis and other stigmatized diseases, sex workers, and people who use intravenous drugs for a unique set of felony laws and punishments. The difference in these laws is related to who they are and whether they have been diagnosed with an infectious disease such as HIV. A number of the state law amendments to date still allow felony prosecution of people living with HIV and sex workers, as you'll see on that map. For a real end to this discrimination, it really is time for all of us to reach beyond the HIV silo, to engage racial and reproductive justice organizations and those with lived experience in criminal justice and immigration systems. And I think by saying that, I'm really just underscoring the points and discussions from the first panel, for those of you who may have missed that. To Mandisa's point, if anybody heard that, about how those who are in the place of supporting people living with HIV wind up in some cases deputizing themselves in terms of law enforcement. Pretty much every pregnant woman living with HIV who has found herself either arrested or losing her children has had that happen because a so-called well-meaning social worker or physician decided that that kind of intervention was necessary. Our wonderful array of panelists will briefly introduce themselves and in a sentence describe their engagement in decriminalization, including any unusual strategies or coalitions they've used. We'll then have a conversation about paths forward and hopefully new strategies and partnerships, and also what some of the barriers are to accomplishing that and getting a broader decriminalization movement, because after all, awareness is nothing without action. And so I think for my first question, Norman. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not asking questions. I want you to all introduce yourself, excuse me. I'm gonna go by who's on the screen. Dave Laban, please.
Good afternoon, Catherine and others. You tricked me by going to Norman first and then calling my name. My name is Dave Laban. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. We are a national nonprofit located in DC with a mission to serve and support prosecutors as well as their law enforcement and community partners in creating a safer communities through a more just and equitable legal system. APA's work around the criminal laws related to HIV and infectious diseases center on providing education and resources to prosecutors to inform them on the scientific advancements on transmission and prevention of HIV and other infectious diseases. Our efforts also seek to bridge the gap between law enforcement, prosecutors, and the leaders in the scientific and medical fields relative to HIV and infectious diseases, and of course, those individuals whose lives have been infected by these diseases. We recognize that these collaborations are critical to changing the landscape of criminal justice reform and addressing the many disparities present in the justice system. Participation in this webinar is important to APA because it provides a time to deepen this collaboration and coalition building around these efforts. Many of the panelists, and this is an excellent panel, and also the sponsors for putting this together, many have been on prior panels, and we've been working together, exposing the need for change to the way the criminal justice system approaches cases involving individuals with HIV, as well as other infectious diseases. We hope to continue this dialogue and look forward to an engaging discussion. Thanks, Catherine.
Muted. I'm going to go next to Amy, if you would be so kind.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. And hi, everybody. My name is Amy Killalay. I'm a consultant, and I'm here on behalf of NASTAD, the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. So NASTAD represents the folks at the state, territorial, and a handful of local health departments who oversee HIV and hepatitis programs. And I think there is at least one person on from NASTAD in their hepatitis program. So that's exciting to see. You'll probably hear from them too. And you know, by way of sort of overview of NASTAD's commitment to decriminalization and to supporting efforts in the states to reform and get rid of HIV and other infectious disease criminalization laws, I will say two things. NASTAD has been a longstanding partner of Catherine and others, and has used its sort of public health association platform to commit publicly and have its members commit publicly to working to forward the efforts to decriminalize HIV. So that is a longstanding commitment. And as of more recently, also working to ensure an anti-racism lens to its decriminalization work. And then more specifically, and I think when we get into some of the sort of action items and next steps, also working with health departments, HIV programmatic staff, and their public health legal counsel to figure out, before and until legislative changes happen, how can we have a public health approach to the laws that are on the books? So how can we mitigate harm with the laws and regulations that we have? So that's all I'll say in the opening, and it's really good to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Amy. Mr. Brian C. Jones, would you go next, please?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Brian C. Jones. I'm a person who's been thriving with an AIDS diagnosis for 38 years. I am responsible for mobilizing Ohio around HIV criminalization laws, and I am proof positive, all puns intended, that one person can make a difference. A unique approach that I utilize when trying to approach HIV criminalization laws is the DIRT advocacy movement. DIRT is an acronym for direct, inspiring, reachable, and teachable. It's conversations for Black people that look like us, live like us, and talk like us. Because you first got to cultivate that dirt before the grass can grow. The great thing about the DIRT advocacy movement is it meets people at the intersections where HIV and AIDS festers. A lot of times we hear stigma, stigma, stigma. There's stigma in everything, being too tall, too dark, too light, too small. The stigma exists and festers in the systemic and structural disparities that exist. Many times when I do training of the DIRT advocacy model for providers, I ask them what barriers exist in the Black community. And then they come up with the barriers. Then I ask them, what barriers do you have? Because it's amazing how many people who are out in the field doing this work, they work from their own implicit biases and say that it's the barriers of the Black community, such as Black people don't want to get tested. They don't want the information. They don't want the knowledge, and nothing could be further from the truth. So I think we've got to have these real conversations that talk about privilege, because the HIV and AIDS community totally is not a kumbaya moment. Racism and discrimination does exist within those walls. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And now I will jump over to Norman, if you would go next, sir.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And let me just say, first of all, that I am very grateful to have been to have gotten the invitation to participate in this observance of the first HIV Criminalization Day. and I'm honored that Fair Trials was invited to be a co-sponsor of the event. Just a little bit about my background. I am currently the CEO of Fair Trials, which is an international global criminal justice watchdog. And we are striving to bring humanity and fairness and justice to the international criminal justice system, where we have offices in several different places, Brussels, DC, and in London, which is where I am speaking to you tonight. It is nighttime here. I came to this issue because I have been working on overcriminalization for many, many years. Prior to my tenure at Fair Trials, I was the executive director of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, which has been leading on this issue. I was there for 15 years, and I'm a former criminal defense practitioner. I practiced for many years, and I've seen the damage that we've done with these laws. By way of introduction, there's a lot of things I hope we get into during the course of this discussion, but I want to ask all of you to reflect on something. And I know that many of you, well, you're all working, I think, in the United States, you're working locally, you're working on the state level where we really have to make the difference. But I think it's helpful once in a while to reflect on America and its role in the world. We are a leader and we should be proud of that, but not always. The United States was the first country to pass HIV criminalization laws in the 1980s. And now, because of our leadership, there are 159 countries that have these laws. Some are worse than others, but they are all pretty horrific. Just to give you an idea, looking just at Europe alone, there are 18 countries in the World Health Organization, European Union countries that have HIV specific laws, and 31 countries have prosecuted people living with HIV. So we've got a massive job to try to fix this internationally. But I particularly, as the discussion goes on, I want to talk about the ways in which we see this as a manifestation, as you heard earlier, of gender and racial bias.
Thank you, Norman. Sarah, could you go next, please?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm from Community Health Centers, Arkansas. If you're not sure what that is, it's a Federal Qualified Health Center, so FQHC. We do a lot of work with HIV/AIDS, especially in our rural areas, and also with the reentry program we have here in Arkansas. So prisoners who are reentering back into the world, making sure they're getting tested and the healthcare that they need as well. We really focus on that. I'm also the co-chair of the Arkansas HIV Reform Initiative, along with the current speaker we had, Eric Reese, and working with that coalition as well, reaching a lot of everyone that we can in Arkansas. Arkansas has rural areas that I hope that we talk about, that population right there that really needs conversation, and they're missing a lot of the education and resources they need if they're living with HIV/AIDS or they're trying to prevent from getting HIV. But I'm glad to be on this panel today. And again, I want to thank Catherine for inviting me and having me here. So thank you.
We're happy and lucky to have you, Sarah. And finally, Dr. Jeff Birnbaum.
Hi, my name is Jeff Birnbaum. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a physician. So in preparation for today, Catherine was asking me a lot of questions that really pushed me to think about things, because there are more lawyerly like questions than doctorly questions. So thank you for pushing me to think a little bit, Catherine.
Welcome to you, Jeff.
My own background is that as a physician, I guess you could say I grew up with the AIDS epidemic. I started medical school in August of 1982, and I've remained in the same building addressing HIV and AIDS since then. So I've been at SUNY Downstate in Brooklyn for the last 40 years, the last 30 of which I've been director of the HEAT program, Health and Education Alternatives for Teens, which is a fancy acronym that started off as a way to not have HIV in the title of the clinic. So it was a way to destigmatize adolescents and young adults coming in for care. Our sort of target or focus population is young people ages 13 to 24. In more recent years, as we've gotten into PrEP work and transgender care, we've loosened up the upper age limit. We see people under age 30. And I guess in terms of my connection to today's topic, I've been on the advisory committee or advisory panel for CHLP for many years. I've consulted from a medical perspective on several HIV criminalization cases, all of which get me really upset when I hear what people are being locked up for. The one most salient case in my mind is that of Nushawn Williams, and having, if folks are familiar with that case, and having gone to upstate New York to testify on Nushawn's case. Nushawn has been over 10 years in prison after his sentence was finished, simply because he's a Black man with HIV. And there's no other reason to keep him in after he's completed his sentence. Also worked with CHLP on sexual health issues around youth and juvenile justice and foster care. And I can talk more later on, but that's kind of opening salvo on why I'm here on the panel today.
So Jeff, I think just to, since you provide an excellent segue to a particular case, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Nushawn Williams case from your perspective. As you mentioned, it's 12 years over his original sentence for having sex with young women while he was diagnosed with HIV when he was 19 and 20 years old. Could you talk about the experience of testifying on his behalf? You know, what was your experience in terms of how the court viewed the case and viewed your testimony?
You know, one of the things that was really disturbing in the courtroom that day, and it was interesting to meet Nushawn, who just seemed like somebody whose life had been taken from him. Granted, whatever crime he committed, he had long past served his sentence, and so just meeting him in one of the side rooms outside the courtroom was really an eye opener for me. Like, this guy he has no recourse. They've locked him up and thrown away the key. So I went in with a sense of empathy towards him after meeting with him. And as folks came into the courtroom, it just seemed like a lot of buddy backslapping between the attorney from the Attorney General's office, whose name I can't recall, and the judge. And it just seemed like the attorney from the Attorney General's office walked in with a sort of haughty arrogance, like, this is a slam dunk. I have public enemy number one, a Black man with HIV. This is a win for me. I don't even have to open my mouth to fight here. And one of the first questions he had asked me was, how much did you get paid today, Dr. Birnbaum? And I said, well, I didn't pay anything. They paid for a cab and bought me lunch and flew me up here. But I think the fact that I was not a paid witness, paid expert witness, got them riled up a little bit. There were a lot of questions that were asked to me about other provider reports, in particular psychiatrists who had an exam with Nushawn and kept asking me to comment on that. And I said, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm an HIV specialist, and I can talk about the fact that his viral load is undetectable and he does not pose an infectious risk to anybody as long as he continues to take his medication and remains in care. I was really shocked when I read the court findings afterwards, where in the judge's report, the judge claimed that I refuted the psychiatrist's findings. I was very clear. They were asking me questions that were outside of my realm of expertise, and I did not feel comfortable answering them. And it seemed that they were trying to get me to agree with a psychiatrist who apparently, it seemed, had not really examined Dushan himself. If I'm not mistaken, Catherine, my memory of that. Although I had some real issues with what the psychiatrist had written, I said, I'm not a psychiatrist, and that isn't how it showed up in the court papers, and he remains locked up today. So it was a real eye opener. I talk with patients every day, most of whom are virally suppressed, almost all of whom are virally suppressed about protecting their partners. And they're not in jail for having sex. And quite often they don't tell their partners their HIV status, but they are protecting them. I also talk with people who are not virally suppressed. I do not bring up the concept of criminalization of what they're doing in any way, manner, or form, but I do talk with them about risk to themselves if their partner finds out that they're positive in terms of physical violence and so on. So there's a lot of counseling that goes on. And it just, you know, it just seems like such a deeply rooted wrong in our society that he is still locked up just because he's HIV positive. So that's my answer to your question.
Thanks, Jeff. I think you have referenced, your perception that race had an awful lot to do with why Nishan is locked up. And I wanted to ask Brian a question that's related to that. We hear a lot about intersectionality in the HIV community. There's a lot of reference to this or that being intersectional, this issue or that issue. And I'm wondering whether you think that those of us who are part of, who live inside the HIV silo, I suppose, engage racial and gender justice organizations enough in this work?
I would say no, because the premise in which they work from, many stakeholders and ASOs work from a paternalistic standpoint. And I think it's important that it's a shame that I first have to preface it with a Sankofa moment, which means to go back and fetch. If we look at the history of HIV and AIDS, in 1981, when they first released the article in the New York Times about 41 homosexual men who were white, they failed to mention that in the same calendar year that 86 Black people had contracted the same gay cancer. So the narrative has always been against us from the beginning. They didn't start releasing our numbers as Black folks till 1983. In 1988, of all the AIDS diagnosis of Black people, women represented half of that. And by 1983, those who inject drugs had far surpassed those white gay men. So the narrative was not always true. By the time they started releasing our numbers in 1983, Black people accounted for 26% of all AIDS diagnoses. And another problem was the CDC said that they gave these defining illnesses and cancers, but they failed to mention cervical cancer, which is unique to women, and specifically Black women, because they didn't have access to healthcare back then, because the diagnosis that the CDC was giving didn't include them. So that's how they came about and said, women don't get AIDS, they just die from it. That was a slogan back then. In 1988, women had surpassed for a brief moment those gay men who had contracted this virus. So if we look at the history in which a lot of these organizations work from, I often hear the saying, nothing about us without us. Well, Black folks have to be wary of programs that claim to be about us, for us, and really don't include us. So when it comes to real intersectionality, it's only used for convenience. We are only brought to the table when it's convenient for funding. We're not brought to the table to hear our perspective, because if we were, a lot of these organizations would have Black leadership. That is the problem. These organizations were started by misogynistic white men, and the model is still the same. Just because you have a lot of Black people working for your agency doesn't mean that it's a Black agency. It's still working from a white privileged perspective. And that is the problem when we talk about intersectionality. It should be no surprise that Black people are most impacted by HIV and AIDS, because we're most impacted by everything else. They tend to put the narrative out there that Black people are most at risk because of our sexual behavior, because of our rampant drug use. We have no more sexual partners than our white counterparts. We have no more rampant drug use than our white counterparts. Another problem is young men, they continue to say, MSM used to denote a behavior, but it's become an identity for our young Black same gender loving men. We're reducing everything that they do to just sex. I don't care if you're having sex with somebody different every day, doesn't discount the fact that you're not searching for love. And I think lastly, the point is, and Catherine and Bruce Richmond, I both applaud you for this. White people must learn to leverage their privilege for the greater good of the fight. The U equals U global movement is a perfect example of this. Center for HIV and Law and Policy is a perfect example of this. I rang y'all phone for maybe 2 years before, and y'all finally said, okay, Mr. Jones, we're coming in. But it has to take that kind of give and take from agencies in order to truly talk about intersectionality, because many of the people who claim to know, they say meet people where they are. Many of the people who get all this funding can never meet people where they are because they've never been where they're at. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think some of your points about racism and misogyny we'll want to come back to. But I wanted to ask Sarah, what are decriminalization coalitions may be missing about the issues that are specific to rural communities? You know, whether it's the issue of organizing or the issue of stigma. I mean, what's different there and what are we missing?
I think for the rural area, it's stigma. It is truly stigma. And I mean, I agree with Brian and his sentiment, but it is, you know, I do have to say in the rural area, you do have to meet them where they are. They are in a smaller community. They trust their community. They don't, like they say, we don't trust these city folks coming here talking to us about HIV, AIDS, and talking about sex or intersexuality. And even saying the word intersexuality, it might be foreign into that rural community. Meeting people where they are is not just, let's bring some information. It's actually understanding the language, understanding the community, understanding what the stigmas are in that community. Is there stigma coming from not just from their home, but from their school and from their churches about HIV, about criminalization, and what happens, especially when we're dealing with the rural area, when we have re-entry program and someone's coming out of the prison system and they're going back into that small community. That small community in itself already has a stigma on this person. And then this person might have HIV, and then there's another stigma that's put on them that's in that small community that can make them be isolated and not reach out and get for help. So that's where we're trying to meet people where we are, is that we're having these honest conversations, honest dialogues with them, but we're also using the language that they're using, and we're also going into their churches, we're going into their communities. We're not coming there like we know it all. And we're not coming in there like we're trying to save you, but we're trying to give you the resources that we know that we can better help you in your community. Because we help one person with HIV, we're helping 10 people with HIV in that community. And it spreads further and further throughout that rural area. So
I have another question for you, Sarah, related to that. So you're trying to do you're doing organizing in your community, you're reaching into rural areas. How does, and stigma has many different aspects to it. And I mean, this is a big rock you're rolling up a hill. How does a relatively small organization like yours tackle that? And do you feel, as a community organization, do you have the resources you need to focus on decriminalization, let alone all the stigma related issues that you're talking about? How do you do that? And do you have enough? If you don't, what would you need?
So for us, it's about partnership. I'm with community health centers, but we have about 200 plus health centers in the state of Arkansas that are out here that also have right programs in their areas. And so also part of being coalitions like the Arkansas HIV Reform Initiative, along with Eric, working with those partnerships with our health department. Those help us, give us the resources that we need so we can go into those areas, and that we're not overcommitted and we're not overdrained, because I think that happens a lot is we tackle everything and you're burnt out. And partnerships is what keeps us from being burnt out, and meaning burnt out, not just mentally and physically, but burnt out on resources. So that's why we bring these coalitions together. So that's why I've sit on these coalitions and our health department, and everyone comes together and saying, hey, how can we tackle this together? And it's not just put on one entity to get it done. Just like what we're doing here, there's many organizations on here that are representing. This is a partnership in itself. So what we share today is helping each other so we can take back and help in our communities. This is how we do the fight. It's partnership, not solo, but working together.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I think certainly some very useful guidance for people that want to go forward with this. It's not a one-person campaign or a one or two organization campaign. We need a diverse set of organizations and people involved in this. I wanted to come back to Norm. You were talking, you worked domestically for a long time. You're now working internationally. Who's bearing the brunt of HIV and status prosecutions outside the US to the extent that you know?
Well,
how does it compare with the United States?
It's as bad as it is in the United States, and I think there's a couple of things that really illustrate the problem when you start legislating personal behavior, whether it's health related, gender related, or anything along those lines. I mentioned the high number of European countries that have enacted HIV criminalization statutes. England and Wales have not. And they have had prosecutions, but the prosecutions are under existing law. And it's a very high burden, very much like the burden that's laid out in the positive justice principles. It has to be intentional. There's a specific intent requirement. There has to be causation, and there has to be an actual infection. It can't just be that somebody was put at risk. Now, I mention that because at the same time, we're seeing something around the world which we didn't see that much in the United States, which is criminalization related to COVID. We've had a lot of controversy about mask requirements and so on and so forth, but we haven't seen a lot of arrests. That's not true in other places. And the UK is a perfect example. And I was just listening so attentively to what Mandisa was saying when she said, it's minorities and it's poor people, the elite, the people in power, they don't suffer the brunt of this kind of approach to law. And the classic example of this is, many of you probably heard that the British Prime Minister is in a bit of a scandal because he was having parties during the same time that the rest of the country was told you can't congregate, period. And in May of 2020, when he had the first of those parties, 807 people were prosecuted in the UK with fines up to £3,200, $4,000. And those fines, of course, can lead to other consequences when they're not paid. And during the course of the first year of the pandemic, it's astonishing to know that you were twice as likely to be prosecuted for a COVID violation if you were Black or another minority. And even more telling is that there was, in that same year, a 24% increase in stops, in searches. And if you were Black, you were 7 times more likely to have been stopped and searched during that period of time. The equivalent of 1 in 5 minority people in London were stopped and searched during that period of time. So what's my point about all of this? This is part of the larger problem of overcriminalization. The incessant desire to use the criminal law to deal with all kinds of disfavored personal, economic, or social behavior. And until we, as a community of impacted people, a community of advocates, a community of prosecutors and defense lawyers, come together and say once and for all, we are not going to use the criminal law like this. We are going to continue to go down this road. If it's not this, it'll be the next virus. And so, I'm heartened by the fact that there are coalitions, there are groups like Sarah's group, and Catherine, like the work you've been doing, and Brian's been. All of this great work is going on. I've learned, and I'm new in this new position. There is a group called AIDS Action Europe. There are 420 NGOs that are working across Europe on these issues. And I will say, finally, that work has paid off at least somewhat. In 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution condemning, among other things, in terms of promoting, good policy, condemning the criminalization of AIDS, of HIV, and people living with HIV.
Those are some pretty compelling points. And I think that some of what you were saying ties in with a lot that Brian was saying, and really, it really makes me think. Often people who are negotiating what we're going to live with in terms of a criminal law are not the people that are going to have to live with it. And I think, and that's kind of the point I think that Brian was making, that Sarah was making, and that was made in the previous conversation. For those who missed that panel, Nathan Cisneros from Williams Institute was pointing out that the overwhelming majority of people prosecuted in the states where we have real deep dive on data that the Williams Institute did are Black. People of color, probably more even than show up in the data, because Latinx people are usually lumped in with white people. And also the vast majority in California, Florida, Georgia, are sex workers, are women who are sex workers. Those are the folks that are actually getting sentenced, convicted, and sentenced and serving time. And one of the common denominators is that they all had public defenders. And that doesn't mean they didn't get good representation. It means that they were poor and they were eligible for free representation. I wanted to turn to you, Dave, and ask you, what role do state and local prosecutors play, or could they play, in this kind of law reform that we're talking about?
Well, I think the key is a lot of what first where Norman was at. And I love the fact that he brought in the COVID discussion, because that was one of the things, and Catherine, many of the organizations, we joined together saying, this is not a criminal offense, this is a health offense. That's where we need to have it. And I loved Eric's comments in the last panel, saying with a lot of legislators, their focus is, oh, I thought we already dealt with it as a health issue. So I think where Norman is at is the good one. I love the fact we're talking here about Arkansas, because yesterday there was a wonderful opinion piece kicked out by Christian Samuel. And right away, it points out that first, the Arkansas law exposing another person to HIV, Class A felony, and you could be convicted or accused for the non-disclosure. So I think for those trying to work with local prosecutors, it's the criminalization of the non-disclosure, not the criminalization of the status. So I think that's the first. If one, and that's why I think it's too bad this panel got off in civil commitment and appearing that status was sufficient to convict somebody. I think that's, if you want to work with the prosecutors and the law enforcement, let's really talk about what we're saying. But then the pathway that she gives is outstanding, or he. There's no pronouns out here. What they point out is neither the intent to transmit HIV or Norma gave the actual transmission need to occur to change the law, nor do any proactive steps such as being on treatment do they come into the law. Those are the kind of changes that need to be done. And for the local law enforcement and the prosecutors, and the discussion also in the rural communities, I was asking the question about what are their experts? We need doctors like Dr. Birnbaum to come in and explain to what was talked about in Nushan, that he's on treatment with an undetectable load. That relates to, especially if you're going to charge somebody with a crime for not disclosing, well, you can't disclose something that's not relevant, right? That you're at a zero. And so therefore being at a zero, you should not be prosecuted at all. That can get you back to the circular status type of offense. So I think, Catherine, if that's probably about as clear as mud, but I think it's right away.
No, not at all. And I'm hoping we'll be able to come back to some other questions about prosecutors, but I do think it's important to remember that even if someone isn't on antiretroviral therapy, the most risky type of sex is to be the bottom, being the receptive partner in anal sex, and then it is 98% unlikely. It's 98% likely that you will not be infected. The risk of infection from the riskiest type of sex is a little less than 2% per sex act. So, I think part of the problem is not so much viral load, because as you know, with COVID and all these other diseases, they're a whole lot easier to transmit than HIV. The problem is, the reason it really is status is because it's only that status that triggers a type of law that doesn't require intent, that doesn't require, and that usually doesn't even include any kinds of defenses. It's simply, you've been diagnosed, you did something that for everyone else is legal, and it doesn't matter whether anything happened. But and on that issue, and I think just about the stats in terms of transmission risk, I wanted to turn over to
or Catherine, I think that's a piece with our joint work, and that's why I was quoting the issue of where's Arkansas trying to go, keeping this real today. You just pointed out, intent is so key. Having specific intent to if you're going to have these laws, then you must have that within there. If not, now you have a problem statute, which is going to go to the wrong way. And then I want to circle back to the locals. That's why the doctors are so important, because that's how the case is going to get the local law enforcement and to local prosecutors. Is someone in the medical community is going to say this person caused this issue, and the victim will come forward on that. So that's why I think this is a really important day, and it's really important, like this panel, we've got both the defense lawyers as well as the physicians, because that's the direction to go. And our respective organizations are about to put out a fact sheet for prosecutors, as well as law enforcement, directly on the point of what are all these transmission rates, what does this all mean, and what do the treatments mean? I don't want that to get lost. Prep is huge.
Actually, that's the point that you actually teed up again, the question that I was going to take over to Amy, because I think what I mentioned, the stats that we were talking about, are statistics, I know you know them, And I think most of the people, well, I'm certain everybody that's on this panel knows this, but a huge number of people in the community still think about HIV as highly infectious. The ignorance around HIV, not just in the general community, but among physicians and lawyers and judges, is pretty much unchanged. And we've seen the impact of education even with prosecutors, where an infectious disease doctor presents to some of your peers, Dave, and then they change their minds. The information changes mind. And so my question for Amy is, do you think that sexual health literacy in fact does have an impact on criminalization? And if so, do you think that state departments of health prioritize sexual health literacy sufficiently?
Yeah,
it's kind of a two-part question.
It's a two-part question. No, I appreciate it. It's a big question. And so, I mean, taking the first part first, do I think sexual health literacy has an impact on HIV criminalization statutes and prosecutions? Yes, absolutely. I think we're all talking about different ways that systems influence our criminal justice system in the way that it does or does not work for certain populations. And so I would absolutely put sexual health literacy there. I think the specific ways that it shows up is that you've got, you know, sort of like a perfect storm of laws that are on the books that are often really poorly drafted decades ago. So at a time where, you know, our current science and what we know about HIV was very, very different. And our current response and treatments for HIV were very, very different. And then you have them implemented by human beings who are subject to their own, you know, sort of world or sphere of influence in what they know to be true about sexual health. And so that is the perfect storm. So if you've got any like breaks in all of those parts, you have a poorly written, vague HIV statute being prosecuted in ways that do not reflect science at all. So my point is, you know, sort of to your second question of where do, and I would say, you know, governmental public health writ large, I think there's a role for both state and local health departments to play in this. So governmental public health at the state and local levels, where do they fit in? Absolutely, there's a role, and those health departments play a role in sexual health writ large, and you know, in trying to ensure that, particularly at the sort of education level in schools, that school health programs reflect science. For this issue in particular, though, I want to flag, you know, one very concrete thing that has happened is that you've got, you know, health department officials who are weighing in during these legislative hearings and, you know, advocacy, other advocacy actions to speak data and science to those efforts. And I think that does give, you know, a public health and sort of science-based response to some of the arguments that are neither public health nor science-based. And so you see that in, you know, in testimony in some of the states who have been, you know, grappling with and reforming their laws by governmental public health officials. You see that in, you know, national organizations that are trying to reflect a sort of, you know, national sense of urgency around these issues, with both NASTAD and more recently the Council for State and Territorial Epidemiologists giving a sort of science-based bullet by bullet. This is why these laws don't do what you legislator or you prosecutors think that they do. It's not forwarding public health, and actually it's not even reflecting the science of HIV. So that's sort of my with the remaining time basic answer to the question, but it's a big one and it's a good one.
Well, you know, and I think, I mean, you made some really important points. There have been health departments that have, you know, people who are AIDS directors in their states who stepped up and very publicly criticized the laws and also supported reforms. And even several years ago in Georgia, someone from the CDC testified in front of the committee that was looking at their HIV criminal laws. But it's actually pretty rare. I mean, and in fact, I mean, if you look across the 30 plus states that have specific HIV specific laws, and then the other states where prosecutions are still happening anyway, such as Texas, why don't we see, more of a reflexive response from health departments, stepping up and saying, this doesn't make any sense. This is not the right way to approach disease at all. We should not be using a carceral response. Why don't we see more of that? And why, in some states, they actually are more of a barrier than a conduit to change. So, I mean, what do you think about that?
I think it's an excellent question. And then I think it reflects that yeah, there's variability out there. And I would say I'm here speaking for NASTAD, and I can't speak for every single health department or official, but I think some of the reasons for the states where health departments have perhaps been less visible in the public fight against these laws. As many people know, particularly in the past 2 years, governmental public health and public health writ large has been under attack. And I don't think that's hyperbole, that is truth. And so the political environment in these states makes it very, very difficult for governmental public health officials to engage in any way, shape, or form in the legislative process. There are sometimes very strict rules where if that happens, that health department official will lose their job. And so, that is what it is. And some sort of health officials will take risks in spite of that, and some will not. So there's that. And the other thing that I would say to your other point of, we know there are folks in health departments who are not only not standing up to say, scrape these laws from the books, but also in some ways are complicit in the implementation of laws. I want to note that's an important thing. And I think that historically we have seen that happen. But I think with NASTAD's focus and others, we can ensure that health departments do not act as an arm of law enforcement, but act as the voice of public health that they should be. And so I have seen in my work at NASTAD, and I think NASTAD's work, especially in ensuring that health departments are not releasing data for law enforcement purposes, even if the health department can't go to the legislature, they can work with their public health attorney and say, no, like this is how the law should be interpreted, and within the bounds of that law, which is crappy and we know it and we don't like it, but we're existing within it right now, within the bounds of that law, this is the red line where we will say we will not release data, we the health department become an arm of law enforcement. And so I just want to say that as there are other ways, there are other avenues that health departments can support these efforts and protect human beings, even if they can't be the ones who are going to the legislature.
That's really helpful. And it makes me think, Amy, that knowing as we do that like listens to like, perhaps we are not engaging the more progressive, outspoken Department of Health officials, and maybe even NASTAD itself. Some of these are in the conversations with local health departments to, so they understand why NASTAD has taken a position against these laws. In fact, NASTAD, the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors, was the first organization to issue a consensus statement against criminalization. I wish we had more time. I am going to actually squeeze over the finish line to see if anyone on the panel would like to add to some of the recommendations. Oh, Brian, you go for it, honey. I knew that hand was going to go up.
Well, first of all, I think we have to stop making excuses for health departments. Our health department, our state health department has yet to sign on to U equals U. Also, the recommendation is this: the government can't have it both ways. On one hand, when it comes to giving us health care and Social Security, they say it's a manageable chronic condition. But when it comes to prosecuting us, they say that it is a death sentence. Which one is it? Another thing is, we can't treat HIV as the single man on the island. And I often quote Audre Lorde, who says, there are no single issue fights because people don't live single issue lives. To David, you were talking about the criminal system and that thing. If we don't talk about how setting bonds for people, it used to be done so to put people back into the community, but now it's been held as a penalty. So there's so many other moving parts around prosecution that is not just HIV. It's just mass incarceration is real, and they're using all these tools to continue to lock Black people up. Molecular surveillance, I won't even deal with that. We have got to start dealing. HIV is just a symptom of the larger problem, which is privilege. And that's it. We've got to try to have a hard conversation about privilege. And lastly, white folks, when we invite you into our space, you don't need to come there to speak. You don't need to come to try to save us. You need to come listen. And that is the problem.
That was a fabulous way to sum things up, Brian. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. I wish we had more time. I'm sure we will all continue the conversation and hopefully have more webinars like this going forward. It was a great panel. And now I'm going to hand it back to Linda, please.
Thank you, Catherine. We would like to thank each of our panelists for sharing their time and professional expertise regarding the significant harm HIV criminalization laws pose, and making the connection as to how these laws fit into the broader pattern of criminalizing people based on disfavored identities, health status, and disabilities. We would like to extend a special thank you to our listening audience. We hope this webinar brought greater awareness and inspired you to join us in our fight or re-energize you to continue in the fight to decriminalize HIV. We urge you to share the information you've learned today with other stakeholders, family and friends, and on your social media platforms. We all have a collective obligation to protect and uphold the rights of all citizens. In addition to taking all the great information from the robust and insightful panel discussions, our simple charge to you today is stand with us. Thank you.